All right, so this is going to be chapter 9. Today we're talking about idealism and colonial physical education. So we're moving on to um, the early days of the United States of America and into the Americas, and how the philosophies that came over into the Americas are now influencing how the early stages of America is handling physical education. So the main philosophy that we're going to deal with here is idealism. Now, idealism is a philosophy that was already popular in Europe, particularly Germany, and it traveled throughout England and France. And then once that the colonies started to be formed within what is now the East Coast of the United States, um, we saw those ideas start to kind of come into play, and they largely were affecting how sport and play were handled. Just like every other culture that we've talked about, um, the philosophies that were popular at the time really affect how the society views sports, views physical education, and its importance and what it is used for. Now, idealists are believe that basically that the entire universe can be conceived or imagined by the mind, and the mind is what is most important in perceiving what is around us and what is real and what is important and what exists. So the reality of the world is less dependent on actual physical objects, but rather what we perceive. So what the mind is able to imagine and create is more real than what um, is physically there, and that's what it's kind of built upon. Um, so we know what's around us exists based off the formulations of our mind. Now, the idealist we're going to focus on three specific topics, and these topics you'll see are not new to idealist, but rather kind of the same questions everyone has been asked. But they're worried about the existence of God. They're worried about the self, the person, and knowledge. And how do we get to each of these? And how do we determine each of these? Um, and the philosophical framework that they use is called idealism. Um, so again, they're kind of addressing this question of how do I come to know something? How do I actually know something is real? And again, they determined that was based off what the mind was perceiving. Now, based off this idea, you can kind of build outwards into all philosophy. So there's a core principle here. So idealist, again, believe that understanding the nature of knowledge will clarify one's reality. So realities, it's important to understand how we get to the knowledge that we have. How do we determine that that knowledge matters, that it's accurate, which is important because if you don't have this foundational layer to say what I'm perceiving is true, the knowledge that I have and that I'm building upon in the future is true, then you don't have something secure to build upon. So ideals are going to be our ideals, these ideas of what is reality, must come through logic, is what the idealists would argue. So they kind of approach this using if-then statements. For example, if reality is the mind and all ideas are conceived by the mind and anything conceived by the mind exists, then any idea conceived by the mind exists. So we can trust what our mind is perceiving, and we can trust our perceptions if reality is mind. And then if ideas are conceived by the mind and anything conceived by the mind exists, you get their kind of how they build up to this point. So what this means is that sensory experiences are very important into determining reality. There is a truth out there. The truth is based off of what is perceived, and it's also important to remember that in idealism, they would argue that it's important to understand that everything in the world is connected, everything has a relationship, and because everything has a relationship and is connected, then you can kind of make statements of saying, if this exists, then this exists, if this is true, then this is true, and kind of build outwards based off this core principle that the reality is what the mind creates. So again, reality in this scenario would just be a system of logic and order established by the universal mind. All right, let me center that again. Okay. So how does this actually apply to sport and physical education? Well, idealism is used to answer the question of what is good, what is actually good. So if you are to determine that physical education is good through a system of philosophy, then it would then be your moral imperative to include physical education as part of an educational experience. So this is a moral imperative, and it's idealism would, if you trace idealism, you're going to come to the conclusion that being physically active improves your quality of life. It gives you strength. It gives you time to relax and unwind. It's good for us, and therefore it's our moral objective to include it. But beyond this, in physical education, it also dictates how we handle assessing and evaluating students. So it's important to improve upon where we are. So rather than saying, for example, I'm going to grade you in PE class based off how fast you can run a mile. Anyone who can run a mile in 8 minutes or faster gets an A. Anyone who can do 9 minutes or faster, B, 10, C, 11, D. And if you're 12 or more, then you fail this class. No, rather it would be more on subjectivity. So are the students getting to a point where they have better behavior? Are they better citizens? Are they having better moral conduct within this idea of physical education? So using idealism, you're then grading best more on like things such as improvement, behaving well, becoming a better person through sport and PE. So, again, these ideas are going to influence colonial America. So here's what colonial America looks like. There's the 13 original colonies, as you've learned before. You have the New England colonies, which is like Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, this area right here. Then down towards the middle, you have the middle colonies. This is largely New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And then the southern colonies are anything from Maryland down all the way to kind of the bottom of modern-day Georgia. So each of these different groups had a different dominant culture. So, and based off that culture and the settlers in that region's background, determined how they address sport. So in New England was very Puritan. Now Puritans, as we'll talk about in a minute, were generally kind of against play. They thought religion was much more important and that play was not, didn't have a place within religion. In the Mid-Atlantic, particularly like New York, you have Dutch Quaker influence. So they're kind of in the middle. They're moderate. Play is acceptable, not the best thing you could be doing, not the most important thing in life, but it's acceptable. Now in the South, you have Catholic, Baptist, Methodist. In these colonies, these southern colonies, they were much more friendly to play. So a lot of what was happening in colonial America, physical education, sport, all that, is going to be happening because of the South. And the South is going to be driving the changes and the developments more so than the middle colonies, and definitely more so than New England. So, the Puritans. Now, the Puritans are a group that generally just weren't big on the idea of play. So they thought if you are a good religious person, someone who follows the Puritan faith, then you would have a strong work ethic, and you could see that based off your greater focus on work and religion than playing. So if you're playing, then you're not doing good things in their mind. So if you're doing something that's neutral and not good, then neutral things are therefore bad, because that time could be better spent doing good things like religion and working hard and building up the society. Now, you may have heard the phrase before, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Basically that someone who isn't working hard, they're just being lazy, are sinning and are more likely to choose sinful things. And that's coming from the Puritans. They were kind of this, Puritans and the Protestants, they're this ones who were more likely to kind of choose work over play whenever possible. They were also big on the Sabbath and maintaining the Sabbath, so they would actually punish anyone caught playing on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was to be dedicated to God, and if you weren't using the time for God, then you were sinning, so they would punish that. Now, what they realized was that actually banning play is pretty much impossible. So, play is important to kind of keep things in line, keep things orderly, everything civil, and have a society that's relaxed and working and doing what they're supposed to do. It helps refresh. So they allowed things, particularly things like fishing, hunting, walking. Those were acceptable activities because they would improve health, they would renew the spirit, and help people go work. But again, the Puritans were largely against play whenever possible. You got to remember, these are the same people who kind of went to war against Christmas, saying Christmas was too much of now a celebratory event and not a religious event. So they said, no, we shouldn't celebrate Christmas in a celebratory sense. We should focus more on the religious side of things. So that's the Puritans. Now, despite that, and especially as time went on and the Puritan influence kind of dissipated and disappeared, you still have amusements in New England and this Puritan culture. One of the big ones was taverns. Taverns were based off like English pubs or German beer halls, European inns, basically places to go drink and play games and socialize. So Puritans originally are not really for that. It exists, but as Puritans lose influence, these things become more common, these social amusements. So a person living in colonial New England might go to the tavern and play card games or play darts or something like that. And that was kind of a introduction to play and sport in that particular place at that particular time. Now, our founding fathers, these people who kind of laid the groundwork for what is now the United States, they were actually generally pretty approving of sport and physical activity. In particular, many of them were big into horse racing. Benjamin Franklin was big into horse racing. And speaking of Benjamin Franklin, so Franklin was kind of this generalist. He did all sorts of things: scientific, education, political. Like he founded the post office. That's pretty political. He did scientific experiments. That's very scientific. But he also was big into education. Now, as he was opening places of education, this public education within the United States, he placed an emphasis on sport and physical activity as part of the curriculum. He believed that that was good for health. He thought it promoted a good educational environment, and it was critical to having a good, well-rounded education. So you're seeing that the early stages of the United States, these founding fathers are pushing for and very agreeable to the idea of having physical education as part of an overall education. Now moving down to the mid-Atlantic, again this is kind of in the New York area, you have the Quakers of Pennsylvania and the Dutch Calvinists in New York. Now again, they're more friendly towards playful activities, though they have a little bit of that Puritan influence. They were really big into horse racing. That was a big one. So horse racing started to take off. You saw these early New England residents were doing things like breeding horses. So they would import a beautiful horse that could run very fast, was strong and powerful, and they would breed it to make stronger, faster horses. They were also big into gambling, so they'd gamble on these horse races along with other sports. They also had different activities, so they might have things like bowling would appear. You would have shooting matches, like accuracy, golf, croquet, tennis, cricket, that sort of things were being developed and in their early stages within the mid-Atlantic of the colonial United States. Now in the South, they were really big into sports relative to the other two. There was less Puritans holding back sports, so sport was able to grow and kind of develop within the Americas in this way. So one, the big one was boxing. So at this time, boxing was really big. So they would wager and they would bet on fights. It was not uncommon for them to use slaves to actually compete in these fights. So, for example, this is a picture of one particular slave who tried to fight for his freedom. So, basically, if you won, you could earn your freedom. If you made your master enough money. So it was this kind of real dark, we're going to force you to fight and do a sport that we don't want to compete in, and we want to watch you get potentially beat up. But if you do well, you can be free. If not, then you have to continue being a slave. So again, slavery is a really dark part of our history, and even within sport and the foundations of sport within the United States, slavery had this very dark influence. So, for example, this guy, I apologize, it's been a long day, I'm completely blanking on his name, but he fought for his freedom, he won a fight, he made his master $100,000, which is huge money, especially at that time. So his master gave him $500 of that and said he could be free, which is great. He got his freedom, he went on. You could see where he actually went to Europe, fought in Britain, pretty much was winning this big title match, you could say, and then they just kept giving his opponent round after round to continue to try to beat him, even though he was winning, until finally the tides turned slightly, and then 44 rounds into the boxing match, they declared the white guy that he was fighting the winner. Real sad, dark part of our history, but that's kind of how boxing was springing out of in the South. You also have horse racing. Again, they were building racetracks in Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, places like that. So you may have heard of a Virginia quarter horse. So the actual distance that they were racing the horses was a quarter mile long. So they had these dirt tracks that were quarter mile long. So men and women believe it or not, even women were allowed to be placing bets on these races. And they're big social events where you'd go, you'd place bets, you'd watch the race, then you'd go socialize afterwards. Let's see here. Oh, in my notes, this is Tom Molyneux. Molyneux. Molineaux. But Tom Molyneux. But yeah. Other than that, social class was big. Upper class were kind of required to have social and athletic skills. They had a much more relaxed lifestyle, just like all these other um, societies before the upper class have it easier. So they need to know how to socialize to kind of keep their social status. They needed to have athletic skills like being able to ride a horse, fencing, dancing, conversation, that sort of stuff. And again, they would often use their slaves to actually be the horse jockeys or be in these boxing matches. Our last bit of influence here was actually the Native Americans, right? So the Native Americans already had established their sports. So they have things like lacrosse. Lacrosse was a preparation for battle. It's already I don't know if Montreat has lacrosse, but I've watched quite a few lacrosse matches. It's a real high intensity, fast paced sport that can be pretty borderline violent, but it was preparation for war. So definitely in this case, was it a kind of real aggressive sport. So when the Europeans came, they saw this. They thought it was amazing. They recorded it. And eventually began to pick it up on their own. Additionally, the Europeans brought horses, which the Spaniards brought horses to the plains in the Midwest. So the natives soon learned to ride the horses, and they became actually pretty good riders themselves. So they would have horse races along with other sports like lacrosse or like dance, things like that. There's lots of ball games there, so the ball games kind of influenced Europe and the colonies. You see a lot of the idea of playing sports with the ball kind of sprung out of these native sports. So the colonies were largely influenced by what was already there. As Europeans brought their own ideas and learned from the natives, they kind of developed the sporting culture, the foundation that we now have for our sporting culture. So that's all for tonight. It's a quick one. But if you have any questions, as always, reach out to me. Thanks.